Welcome to a quick discussion of Final Fantasy for the WonderSwan color. This is one of the earliest remakes of the original Final Fantasy and is incredibly influential. Basically, every future re-release of Final Fantasy I would be based on the WonderSwan color version, despite being a Japan-only handheld version of the game. So if you've played the PS1 version or the Game Boy Advance version, the sprite quality is very similar, but this version does precede the other two. The WonderSwan color was an upgraded version of the WonderSwan, which, like the Game Boy, was originally monochrome. But Final Fantasy was a launch title for the WonderSwan color, and then the PS1 version was released a couple years later in 2002, with the Game Boy Advance version releasing in 2004. There was also a PSP version in 2007 for the 20th anniversary, but that version has entirely different sprites that are a lot more detailed. In general, I feel like Final Fantasy I is incredibly influential, but is not my first choice for Final Fantasy to recommend. It's definitely very difficult compared to later games. There are some quirks about it that make it harder to go back to, especially as someone who started with a lot of the later Final Fantasies, like a very high random encounter rate, and in some versions, no MP. I'm pretty sure in this version that's the case. Instead of having an MP system, you simply have a certain amount of uses for certain magic spells. I'm pretty sure some versions of this game added in magic, but I might be thinking of Final Fantasy, like, 2 instead. So for the WonderSwan color, this wasn't the only Final Fantasy that got remade. Final Fantasy 2 and 4 also got re-released for the WonderSwan color. 3 was planned for it, but never released. I'm actually not sure entirely why they released 4, but not 3, especially because apparently the given reason was a file limitation, and I would think that Final Fantasy 3 would take up less space than 4 on a cartridge, so I'm not entirely sure why that's the case. If I had to guess, another reason could be that it's simply easier to take a game that's already 16-bit technically and remaking it, while with the first 2 games and 3, those were NES or Famicom games, so it would take a lot more work to actually update them. Final Fantasy IV is kind of a weird in-between game, where even though it is a Super Nintendo or Super Famicom game, it was so early in the console's lifespan that it definitely feels a little bit dated. Like, if you look at the sprite quality of Final Fantasy IV compared to the sprite quality of like 5 or 6, it is noticeably more basic. So yeah, it might have just been easier to convert that to a 16-bit style like 5 and 6. So 3 is kind of interesting because when the games would all be re-released, both for PS1 and Game Boy Advance, Final Fantasy 3 was skipped over. So yeah, the PS1 and Game Boy Advance both got 1, 2, and 4. The GBA also got 5 and 6, actually both got 5 and 6 as well, probably because, again, all of those were 16-bit versions. So basically, for Final Fantasy III, it was stuck as an 8-bit game. It never got a 16-bit version, until very recently with the announcement of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster series, releasing at the end of July. So that'll be the first time that basically all of these games are remade in a single style, because even though basically all of the classic Final Fantasies are available on current platforms, they're not all in the same style. So for example, if you go to Steam, you can find Final Fantasy 3 and 4, but the 3D remakes for the DS. 5 and 6 were mobile versions, which were very divisive and are being delisted with the release of the Pixel Remasters. So yeah, this is the first time they'll all kind of be released in a uniform style, which is kind of neat. Even though the Pixel Remasters themselves are fairly divisive for how they look. I think the NES games look okay because they're taking the NES sprites and updating them, but they actually do look noticeably less detailed than even the Game Boy Advance sprites. So in some ways, this version is slightly divisive because it doesn't look as good as a lot of the previous remasters. Also, a separate version for PSP of basically all of the previously remade games was also made, and similarly, 3 was left out, and when Final Fantasy III was released for PSP, it was simply the DS version. But the 1, 2, and 4 remakes were all the pixel style, similar to the Game Boy Advance versions, but updated. I feel like with Final Fantasies, you have a lot of debate over what the definitive versions of some of these games are. I feel like very few people would say the NES versions because of a lot of antiquated gameplay elements. But I feel like with the Game Boy versions and the PSP versions, there might be some debate. I've seen some prefer the updated style of the PSP versions, some people prefer the 16-bit style of the GBA version. The PS1 version is also pretty infamous because all of the PS1 Final Fantasies have really, really bad load times. So, for example, when you open up a menu, it takes a lot longer to load the menu compared to any other version. So, for example, I own Final Fantasy V on PS1 and never got too far because the loading takes so long. So yeah, it is kind of interesting how many times these games have been re-released, and how there really isn't an agreed-upon, universally best version. And it gets increasingly complicated once you get to some of the later ones, like 6 in particular, because a lot of people stand by the Super Nintendo version having the best visuals and soundtrack, but the problem is it's kind of glitchy. Like, a lot of the mechanics don't work as intended. So the actual Super Nintendo version of Final Fantasy III, despite having the best presentation overall, from a gameplay standpoint, is very rough around the edges. Meanwhile, the PS1 version, yet again, has very bad load times, and the Game Boy Advance version actually has bonus content, but has worse visuals. They're kind of washed out by comparison, and the audio quality is really infamously poor. So yeah, probably for Final Fantasy I, assuming the Pixel remasters are okay, I probably would just recommend those for the sake of convenience, because of trying to track down some of these older versions would be pretty difficult, especially, for example, if you have a PSP. I'm pretty sure the PSP store got shut down a long time ago, so to actually download PSP games, you basically have to download them on a PS3, and then upload them to the PSP. On Vita, you can access the PSP store directly, to my knowledge, still, so that is an option. I don't know if Final Fantasy 1 and 2 are actually on PS Vita, though, for the store. I'm fairly certain that 4 is available digitally, but I don't know if 1 and 2 were. So yeah, your options for playing some of these games aren't great, which is why it is cool that these are coming out on Steam. The one downside is being released on Steam and mobile, and not console. That's another very divisive element of the Pixel Remasters. Personally, I feel like a Switch release is inevitable, but a lot of Final Fantasy games will release on PC and mobile first, and then eventually they get console releases, so I feel like waiting on the Pixel Remasters. By the way, for the end of July, only the first 3 are being released, but not all 6. They're planned to be released throughout the rest of the year, to my knowledge, but yeah, for launch, it'll only be the first 3. And yeah, Final Fantasy III is the most interesting to me because it didn't get a 16-bit remake, and the only remake we got was the DS version. So this is kind of a new experience, getting the original kind of style Final Fantasy III is kind of a divisive game because of its ending and certain difficulty spikes being really bad. So I am actually curious to play a more, I guess, authentic version to the NES version, since I've only played the DS version. So yeah, it's very complicated, in all honesty, trying to actually play through these games. Pixel Remasters, I think, will also depend a lot on things like the modding community, because there are some nitpicks people have with, like, the font scaling and things like that. Basically, readability is kind of a problem in these versions, and I am hoping that the PC version will get some amount of modding to basically make it more playable. So for example, in the PC version, for the Pixel Remasters, basically things like damage numbers and actual text are in different fonts. So basically the menus have a very specific font, and then the actual damage numbers, the font appears to be closer to the actual original. And thus, a lot of people really wanted the same font to be used for both, because that just creates a weird disconnect, and the actual, like, text font is really tiny. Other complaints people have are that the sprites are less detailed, which is more noticeable, I think, for the later games. Specifically 6 feels like a major downgrade. This, as an example, is actually less detailed, the sprites for the 1 Pixel Remaster, but because it is drawing a lot more from the NES version than this version, it kind of makes sense. So even that being said, some of the backgrounds do seem to draw inspiration from this version, even though the sprites are mostly based on the NES version, but kind of updated. So yeah, it's kind of a mess of a remaster where it seems to be drawing inspiration from a bunch of different sources for its art style, and it kind of combines everything in a way that doesn't necessarily mesh well. So yeah, I definitely understand why these remasters are not exactly being well received, at least pre-launch. Again, maybe once they release and people actually experiment with things like modding, maybe the reception will be a little bit better. Some games have even gotten updates that were fairly notable, like Chrono Trigger, originally launched in a really bad state, and eventually it was patched officially. So I would like to see a similar thing happen to the Pixel Remasters because of the less than positive feedback, but we'll have to wait and see. So yeah, this is a really interesting version. It's not the easiest to play because I took like a semester of Japanese, and that was like 4 or 5 years ago, so my Japanese is very rusty, but I was actually able to read enough to kind of like buy items before going out into the world, so that was something. I don't know if there's a fan translation for this version. There probably would be by now, though to be fair, why would you play a fan translation of the WonderSwan version when you could also play the GBA version, which has bonus content? Now, in all fairness, as someone who did a basically 100% Let's Play, like, 5 years ago, a lot of the bonus content isn't outstanding for this game. The optional dungeons are pretty difficult, in all honesty, and I remember actually not enjoying them, partly just because editing the videos was a nightmare, because the dungeons were so long with a ton of random encounters. I guess we're leveling up, I think. I would assume that's what's happening, just based on the amount of text on the screen. So yeah, we are level 3 now, but we've taken a lot of damage. Yeah, I definitely would not suggest starting with this game, partly just because you probably will spend a lot of time level grinding. It's kind of the problem with like Earthbound Beginnings. You want to play Earthbound Beginnings once you've already established that you like the Mother series, you don't want to start with Earthbound Beginnings because that will probably make it so you never want to play the other games, because that game is so inaccessible. Like, Earthbound is a little bit grindy at times, but isn't too terrible, and I don't know about Mother 3 because I have still not played that. But yeah, starting with Earthbound Beginnings would definitely not be a great way to start, and similarly, I kinda wish they weren't releasing them in chronological order for the Pixel Remasters, because even though they might require a little bit more effort to release first, I think starting with 4 through 6 would have been better, because those games still have sort of dated design elements, but overall are a lot more solid to the point where they hold up surprisingly well. I just have this feeling that a lot of people are going to start with Final Fantasy 1, 2, or 3, and for example, if you start with 3, you have to deal with, like, a 3-hour-long dungeon with no save points and difficulty spikes, and that'll just basically put people off of ever trying the rest of the series. And as a fan of the series, I really want more people to enjoy these games, but yeah, I would recommend not starting with 1 through 3, maybe start with the Super Nintendo era, and then if you like the games and want to experience more, then go back and play the others, because yeah, you definitely will not have the best time with some of these games, especially if you aren't used to old-style JRPGs. So yeah, it is very interesting to see such an obscure version of this game set a trend for the series for the later remasters. The WonderSwan itself is rather fascinating because it was actually developed by Gunpei Yokoi, who was the creator of the Game Boy, who left Nintendo after the Virtual Boy. So yeah, it is interesting that it had kind of a similar trajectory, with starting with like a monochrome version, then getting a color re-release, but unlike the Game Boy, and like a lot of other handhelds of this era, the WonderSwan and WonderSwan Color never really took off. I actually have been researching the WonderSwan quite a bit lately because I was actually planning a review marathon for the Klonoa series, and I recently learned there was actually a Japan-only Klonoa game for the original WonderSwan. So I was actually experimenting with trying to capture footage of a WonderSwan game for that, and then I found out that Klonoa 2 is not actually available anywhere else besides the PS2 version, so I ended up putting that idea on hold. But then I was like, oh yeah, there's also like Final Fantasy 1 on the WonderSwan. That version is what every other remake is based off of, so it all worked out, even though, obviously I would not do a full playthrough of this version, as I've already done the GBA version, and this is in Japanese, and thus I would not understand most of the story. All I remember, and this is partly because of all the memes of the Stranger of Paradise game, is we start out by having to fight Garland at the Shrine of Chaos. So yeah, I actually don't remember much else of the story beyond that, though. But yeah, the WonderSwan is a very intriguing handheld. It's kind of cool to learn about, like, gaming history that isn't as widely known, like, only recently learning that, like, Gunpei Yokoi was also involved with this, as he was with the Game Boy, even though this was almost like a competitor in a way. But yeah, on that note, that's about everything I had to say about the original Final Fantasy, and a bunch of the remakes as well. It's very interesting, and I hope the Pixel Remasters are good enough versions, even though they don't seem like ideal versions at the moment. So, with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.